They had the cure. They chose not to give it. In 1947, scientists discovered that penicillin cures syphilis. It is cheap. It is widely available. It works within days. The U.S. government knew this, and they deliberately chose not to give it to 400 men who were dying. Not because it was unavailable. Not because it was experimental. Because the government wanted to watch what happened when syphilis went untreated in black men.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the Tuskegee Chronicles, Anatomy of a Betrayal. We're looking at a profound, absolutely staggering institutional betrayal. Let's just get right into it. America did this. They had the cure and watched them die. Just let those words sink in for a second. We're talking about an official initiative where the very institutions that were literally built to protect public health intentionally withheld life-saving medicine. The sheer magnitude of this betrayal, the quiet dread of it all, it's all captured right there in those two sentences. It's the absolute foundation of the history we're unpacking today.
And this brilliantly illustrates the visceral cruelty of what took place. Look at this contrast. On one side, you have the cure. Clinical, sterile vials of penicillin. This was the highly effective, modern treatment. But then you look at what was actually given out in those rural clinics, a single aspirin tablet handed over by a white-gloved hand. Basically a placebo masquerading as genuine medical care. The massive, yawning gap between these two realities, that's exactly where the true tragedy of this betrayal lives.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline, because this wasn't some brief lapse in judgment. No way. This deception spanned 4 decades. It kicks off in 1932 with the initial setup, moving right into a deeply bureaucratic cover-up by the 1940s, even as the cure became widely available everywhere else. It wasn't until 1972 that the exposure finally happened, and unbelievably, it took all the way until 1997 for a formal apology. To put that into perspective, that is 40 entire years of deliberately withheld treatment. Let's start at the very beginning.
So, the year is 1932, and we're in rural Alabama. To really grasp how this started, you kind of have to picture the documentary realism of this specific era. We're talking dusty dirt roads, vast cotton fields right at dusk, small wooden farmhouses. It's a highly isolated, deeply impoverished landscape. And into this setting, a series of official government vehicles, these black Ford Model A's, begin to arrive. You've got government men in suits carrying medical bags, walking into a community that desperately needed healthcare and honestly had almost no access to it.
The way this whole thing began was just dangerously quiet. It was methodical. Black sharecropper families, wearing worn clothing but holding themselves with such dignified posture, were approached right on their own front porches. Now, the arrival of those black Ford Model A cars brought an undeniable sense of official authority, right? But the main mechanism of this deception, it was trust. Trust established through the most mundane human details. A simple handshake between a white-gloved doctor and a black sharecropper. In the 1930s American South, that rare gesture of apparent respect completely masked the dark reality of what was actually being set in motion.
As we roll from the 1930s into the 1940s, the whole environment of our story shifts. We go from those rural dirt roads to the cold, fluorescent-lit interiors of the U.S. Public Health Service offices. You see, the cover-up here wasn't filled with dramatic theatrics or cinematic villains meeting in smoky back alleys. It was something far more chilling. It was the mundane evil of bureaucracy. It lived quietly inside government desks, routine forms, and endless rows of gray-green filing cabinets.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how coordinated the institutional mechanics of this betrayal actually were. The U.S. Public Health Service was literally stamping documents confidential to conceal what they were really doing. But even more incredibly, the U.S. Armed Forces actively collaborated. When the men from Tuskegee were inspected for the military draft during World War II, they were quietly turned away from receiving the standard penicillin treatment that the armed forces provided to everyone else. The entire system, across multiple huge agencies, was actively coordinating to keep these men sick. And honestly, perhaps the most shocking aspect of all is that this wasn't even a tightly kept secret locked in a vault somewhere. The study's findings, which were built entirely on unethical, horrifying data, were being shared openly. Published in highly respectable medical journals. It was hiding in plain sight. Doctors across the country could read the headers of these articles, and yet the medical establishment just let it continue without any intervention whatsoever. That really shows you just how deeply systemic and accepted this betrayal truly was at the time.
Fast forward with me now to 1972. The scene completely changes from those quiet bureaucratic offices to a high-contrast, chaotic newsroom.
Picture a desk lamp casting hard shadows over a journalist furiously typing away at a typewriter. Surrounding them are just massive stacks of leaked, formally confidential documents. After 40 long years of bureaucratic silence and institutional complicity, the dam was finally breaking.
An Associated Press wire teletype begins printing the breaking headline, "Leaked Documents Reveal Decades-Long Study Withholding Treatment." Suddenly, newspaper front pages across the entire country are cascading with the exact same horrifying story. So the crucial point is, this 1972 revelation didn't just expose an isolated incident. It fundamentally, permanently fractured the public's trust in the medical establishment. That's a fracture we still feel the effects of today, for sure. The entire nation was suddenly forced to wake up and look at what its respected institutions had been doing in the dark.
The fallout, it was immediate. Government buildings in Washington, D.C. faced intense, completely unprecedented scrutiny. But the most powerful visual wasn't politicians scrambling for answers. It was the surviving participants themselves. These elderly black men, carrying immense, quiet dignity, finally stepping into public view. Looking directly at the news cameras, they weren't just anonymous data points in a confidential filing cabinet anymore. They were finally seen, recognized and acknowledged by a stunned nation. This was the absolute transition from hidden history to undeniable revelation.
And that brings us to 1997. We're in the East Room of the White House. The atmosphere is highly formal, packed with government officials and a huge crowd. But the absolute focus of the room is right there on the front row. Seated in formal suits, with the heavy weight of age and profound history visible in their faces, are the few remaining survivors of the Tuskegee study. They sit there with the exact same quiet dignity they maintained for over 60 years. It's a moment of official apology, a solemn, incredibly long overdue acknowledgement from the highest office in the land of a completely unforgivable wrong.
Let's move to and see how this builds into the tragic legacy left behind, because alongside the survivors was a truly powerful symbol of what was irrevocably lost. Right there in that formal ceremony room, there was a single empty chair. It wasn't dramatic or over the top, but it held immense visual weight. That desaturated, solemn image of an empty chair represented all the men who died waiting for a cure that had existed all along. It stood for the fathers, the brothers, and the sons who were denied basic humanity, stripping away any political theatrics to leave behind only the raw, undeniable weight of grief.
As we wrap up our explainer today, we really have to look past the historical timeline and directly at the legacy itself. What are the lasting generational impacts of institutional betrayal, and who is left behind when justice is delayed? This isn't just about a medical study in rural Alabama in the 1930s. It is about the deep fragility of trust between citizens and the institutions that are supposedly meant to heal and protect them. When we methodically review this history, we have to ask ourselves, how long do the shadows of such a profound deception truly last in our society? Thanks so much for joining me to explore this incredibly vital piece of history.